I actually really love group treatment because the principles of behavioral activation can be taught in a group as easy as in an individual treatment, and you do reach much more people. But the background of the people is quite different. So if you try to teach the principles to a group of Germans, and there's somebody from Asia among the patients, maybe the person is not, it's not so easy for the person to accommodate to the principles. And once we found out that there's a similarity, that I can say, well, basically it's very much the same like finding your Ikigai.
Find your Ikigai at ikigaitribe.com. On episode 91 of the Ikigai Podcast, I welcome Nathania Rochelle and Jürgen. Nathania is a passionate in-training clinical psychologist, eager to help patients with empathy, psychological methods, and hard work. She believes in the importance of research-based practice and practice-based research. And Jürgen is a professor of behavioural psychotherapy at the Technical University of Dresden. Thank you very much for joining me today, and welcome to the podcast. I'll start with that. You co-authored this article or paper titled A Cross-Cultural Conceptual Comparison of Behavioural Activation and Ikigai. And I thought, wow, that is interesting. And I guess on a personal note, I was surprised to see my name as a citation in the paper. So thank you for referencing me in the paper. That was a lovely little surprise. I never imagined I'll be referenced in a technical paper or a paper based on behavioural activation. So in this article, you propose that cultural bridging is possible between behavioural activation and Ikigai, as they share the same basic principle, the importance of an individual's values of becoming motivated and guiding everyday action decisions. So probably should ask, how did this paper come about, Nathania?
I think this paper came about, this is a little bit more personal, but I think it's fine if I explain it as well. I was looking for topics for my bachelor thesis, actually. So I was just writing on professor and asking, hey, do you have any topics? And I come across Jürgen and I just wrote him, hey, do you probably have some topic? And he brought up this topic, actually. So this started off as like a mini bachelor thesis in order for me to get my degree, actually. But then it became something a lot bigger, I guess, something that I did not quite expect that it would be like that. When I remember writing my bachelor thesis, I had tons of fun doing it, just reading about Ikigai, reading about behavioral activation, and learning about all of these things that are similar and sometimes are not similar, because maybe coming from I come from an Eastern background as well. That topic obviously is very interesting to me. And having study here, obviously I am also German trained in a way, because I do my university and education here to become a psychologist. So I think that really sparks my interest in it. And yeah, that's how I came across Ikigai. And I guess the topic as well, you've seen it in bookstores too, books about it and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. So was it that, Jürgen, you actually introduced Ikigai to Nathania?
That's correct. And you can call it a fortunate accident, because I came across Ikigai. I can't exactly remember, but I guess that some algorithm behind Instagram was the cause. So I just came across Ikigai. I found it interesting, and I bought the book by Ken Mogi on Ikigai to give it to my wife because I thought it would be an interesting read. Then I opened up the book and I saw the 5 principles, and that gave me goosebumps, because immediately I saw the similarity between this Eastern concept and the Western strategy in treatment that I've been using a lot in recent years, which is called behavioral activation. So the reasons why we become active are maybe shared knowledge across cultures, but they may be termed differently. and the strategies to arrive at a fulfilling form of activity are different ones. And so I thought both strategies could benefit from each other and help us to become more flexible in finding our motivations and ikigai moments. So, and that was my thinking, but I've enough to do as a therapist, as a professor, as a researcher, I would say. And then Nathania asked me for a topic. So guess what I told her? What a possible topic. And that's really fortunate that our motivations really came together. And Nathania, I must say, is so talented because it's quite unusual that a bachelor thesis finally makes it into a scientific international journal with external review, which it did, thanks to Nathania.
Well, there you go. Yeah, I mean, a few things on that is I know Ken Moggy's book is booming in Germany at the moment. I think it's a bestseller.
It is,
It's been
yeah.
a bestseller
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
number of months. And interestingly, the 5 pillars are really Ken's personal theory on Ikigai. So it's interesting how it does resonate, I guess, with German readers. And then, yeah, Nathania, I mean, I think writing a paper would probably be harder than writing a book with all these citations and the review process and getting everything accurate. So it must have been, I have this vision, it must be quite hard. But was it hard or enjoyable or both as the author?
I think, I mean, if we're talking about Ikigai here, I think it is definitely a process. It was not easy. It took me some time to like convert it, so to say, from my bachelor thesis to, for me personally, also say, hey, this is something that is good enough that I think I feel pretty good about submitting it to the paper. Like that process was definitely a lot harder than just writing a thesis, for sure. But I do think it is something that I enjoy doing a lot. So, like, even though it's hard, it was something that I thoroughly enjoy. Like, I enjoy reading and, like, just maybe geeking out a little bit on, like, writing it and finding the right words and how to make my idea come across. And also, like, all of these people that has written about it before, like, for them to also get their credit. Because, like, I can only write as good as what the people before me has published and like has done research on, I think. So in a way it kind of reflects my own personal ikigai in a way for that period of time. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, writing's challenging, but it's definitely worth doing. And
Yeah.
I guess it's meaning making. You're expressing yourself. You're expressing this creative self and pulling all these ideas together. So yeah, it does take effort, but it's rewarding when you finish. And I'm sure it was rewarding when the paper was published. So yeah, congratulations to you both. And perhaps we should take time to touch on behavioural activation, what that exactly means. So maybe, Jürgen, would you like to touch on that? Because I think you have a strong history with that, a long history.
Yeah, I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm concentrating in research and in treatment on anxiety disorders and affective disorders, most importantly, depression. And the treatment concepts for depression, many of them are coming from behavior therapy. And one of them, the easiest principle, is called behavioral activation. And that's been developed in the United States by a group around Peter Lewinson and others, like Förster, Brehm, and others. Also, famous depression theorist Aaron Beck integrated behavioral activation in his concept, which had dominated depression treatment for decades. But behavioral activation was not attractive. The basic idea behind behavioral activation is depressed people suffer from doing too little rewarding activities. So what would help them is increase their activation rate. That's really, really simple thinking, but guess how depressed people find that? I mean, it's a little bit ironic even, because that's exactly what they can't do, engage in things. And so behavioral activation got reformulation in the 90s and beginning 2000 years. And that rethinking of behavioral activation integrated value work. So, what your values in your life that you're really committed to. And so
Yes.
there was a shift in the conceptualization of behavioral activation from just doing more pleasurable things toward finding committed action for yourself that serve your values,
Value.
because you cannot do the whole day pleasurable things, and definitely not as long as you're depressed. But if you want to get back into life, it's very helpful to do simple tasks. After having done them, you will feel better than before. And that's really a life principle grounded on wisdom. I mean, do your thing, as small it might be, it gives you better feelings than not doing it. And that's the motivational motor within behavioral activation. But how do you find the right action? And that's quite different. And I don't think that this different from Ikigai. And I don't think that there are such strategic ways within Ikigai like they are in behavioral activation. And that is called activity monitoring and scheduling. It's a form of an inductive method. So you're just monitoring your daily activities, and in your activity and mood protocol, you evaluate how your mood was during and after an activity. And doing this avoids what we call recall bias. But because if you ask a depressed person after a week if there had been any enjoyable activities, a depressed person, the mindset is so negative that the person will answer, no. But if you look at the activities when they occur, you find out that not all activities are giving you bad mood. Some give you not euphoric or wonderful or happy mood, but make you feel okay. And
Yeah.
step by step, you choose to these kinds of activities over other activities, especially depressogenic, as we say, activities like withdrawal, like staying in bed, engaging in negative thinking, paying attention to your own feelings of insufficiency and things like that. So, any activity, even on really small matters, are beneficial compared to just staying in a depressed mood and remaining passive. So
Mm.
that's the idea behind behavioral activation. It's a well tested method. It's as beneficial as the best behavioral methods and treatments, but it's simpler because that's the basic idea. And we have empirical data enough to say that's people helping out of depression. Not all of them, of course, but in many cases, even severe cases, it has been shown that behavioral activation really works in treatment. And to say a last sentence, what I'm thinking is Ikigai can be a close neighbor of
Mm.
behavioral activation in the field of preventing to ever fall into the depressive hole, so to say.
That's what I found attractive of the paper, because I thought I actually had been looking for a paper on Ikigai related to depression, whether it can help with depression, does it prevent depression? And I mean, the value idea is interesting, because if I'm a guest on a podcast, I'll often start by saying, oh, Ikigai is all about, your values, living in alignment with your values. And it's obviously meaning making, but if you live in conflict with your values, whether that's in a job or you're compromising your values in a relationship, it's going to be very hard to feel Ikigai. So I know we're going to touch on values later. So thanks for that definition. Now we might move on to defining Ikigai. And I know you both did a lot of reading on this, and there were many citations. And actually, a lot of your citations refer to quite a few of these amazing people who've been on my podcast, such as Ken Mogi, Chikako Ozawa da Silva, Shintaro Kono, Gordon Matthews, Dean Fido. So with all the insights and all the reading you did, Nathania, how would you define Ikigai, or how did you define Ikigai in the paper?
I think in the paper, because it provides a systematic comparison to both, so I try my best to kind of like stick to the original idea as close as I could possibly get with all of the things that have been published, or like people that haven't been defined how Ikigai is, so to say. But I mean, if taking it also into context with behavioral activation, I do agree that Ikigai is something that makes your life worth living. But I think like it can also, how Jürgen and you obviously already touch on it, like the value base. So I think like it is a life, making life worth living, but it's not just randomly trying to make your life worth living, but also like living your life according to your values. I think I would take it one step further to say life, like the life it's worth living for is the life that you can live out your values.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, Ken in his book, one of the first questions is, what are your sentimental values? And I always thought sentimental was like a really interesting word choice, maybe suggesting the inner child, or this untainted self, because he didn't say core values or most important values. So there's this emotional connection, perhaps Ken's touching on, to your values. So, yeah, I think that's really important. And I guess sometimes I reflect and think, wow, there are millions of people living their life against their values, and it's no wonder they're frustrated and depressed. And in this modern world with so much pressure and so much distraction, and almost it seems now little opportunity to express our values, it seems quite hard for us to feel Ikigai, or for many of us. It's interesting how, Ikigai and behavioral activation have this foundation on values. So we should touch on the aim of the paper. So I might refer to you again, Nathania, and then we might go back to you, Jürgen, as well. So, what was the aim of the paper?
I think the aim of the paper was to obviously provide this parallel, because I think it's very interesting how, I mean, through the reading, the way I understand it, Ikigai has exists for a long time, and it's even like part of the everyday language, so to say. So I think it is very embedded in the culture, whereas like behavioral activation is, like Jürgen also already described, something that is more recent, I think, in comparison to Ikigai. So I think the aim is to kind of put this in parallel and see, wow, there's this like life philosophy that has exists for a long time, and then suddenly in the Western world there is this whole idea, and then it becomes psychotherapy method. So I think the aim is to like obviously bring that into parallel, and also see in a way how can we maybe integrate that, maybe in therapy, but also in the prevention. I think that is the field that I think is also most interesting to see how, because Ikigai is something that, if it's really something that has already exists and people practice it in their daily life. I mean, it's kind of weird to say like practice Ikigai, but let's roll with it. They already exist. Then imagine like the amount of people that would not feel depressed just because they lead a value-based life, and that makes their life worth living, and they have all of these like good feelings. Imagine that.
Yeah.
So I think like to explore those ideas and like broaden the perspective, also to see, not to maybe be as psychological minded in a way, but also try to be more like open up the world for it to reach more people and reach a broader audience. I think that was ultimately the aim for it. Yeah.
Nice. I mean, this often is the case. Eastern wisdom seems to get later validated with Western research. And I mean, Ikigai is unique in that it is used in a everyday kind of language context, but most Japanese don't really talk about Ikigai. And it's something they grow up with, something they, I guess, intuitively understand with life experience. Yet we don't go around saying, it'd be very weird for us to say, hey, what makes your life worth living? Or what's your life purpose, just in a normal casual conversation. Whereas occasionally or rarely Japanese might say, oh yeah, I would say my work is a source of Ikigai, or, they'd use it very casually. So it's fascinating how in Eastern culture these ideas sort of seem to just evolve from their understanding of life or a meaningful life. But in the West, we seem to have to validate and do some research and study, and then we give it a very technical term that's kind of hard to use in conversation. Yeah, would you like to add anything, Jürgen? Because I guess this was your idea, perhaps, let's compare these two concepts.
Yeah, it is. It was my idea. Thanks. Well, one of the many aims of the paper was ultimately to bring researchers together, to unite their efforts. I mean, would make much sense to discuss the core meanings of, as well, of Western values and of Ikigai experiences in a united form of research. And when I start a paper, of course, I have a dream, and the dream is that researchers from the West and from the East would try ask people, what is your Ikigai, or what's the reason why you get up in the morning? And if you ask 1,000 people, I think it's too little. It should be 10,000, because psychology research aims at giving representative answers that are true for the majority of people. And that would be complicated research, because the answers will be very, very different, and we would have to categorize them, and we would learn so much from these answers. And we would learn it for the theory of well being. How do people generate well being with their own actions? Not being angry about politics or others, but just looking at their own action and directing their attention to what they can achieve with what they could do with their own life. And I think that's a very important part of mental health at all. And discussing this is, of course, one of the most interesting topics you can choose. And I'm convinced that research from the West can learn from those ideas, and researchers in the East too could benefit from discussing their ideas with Western, like, therapists or therapy researchers. That's the idea. One of the ideas, which you always hope that if you write a journal article, you always hope that it might stimulate somebody out there. So I'm very grateful that you invited us to the podcast. But that's, at least this time, it's a paper that does have an effect.
It is. I mean, it is quite bizarre. I never imagined I'd be reaching out to academics and researchers and saying, hey, would you want to talk about life meaning and Ikigai? But I love it. And I do love that idea of bringing researchers together and share ideas and themes and perspectives from different cultural perspectives. And I actually did an Ikigai summit last year. So I'd like to do that again, and it'd be great to do that in person, perhaps in Japan. But when I think about Ikigai and when I discuss it, and well-being comes up, and for me, this is almost a word that articulates, like, this is Japan's version of positive psychology in one word, encapsulated in one word, and these themes of life satisfaction, relationships, a sense of freedom, a bright future, meaning and value. And it's fascinating, and the research is seemingly endless, and more papers appearing. So it's great we can talk about this, and we should talk about this. And I think we don't. Most people don't have these conversations. They only have these conversations perhaps at a workshop, or if they need help. We don't sit down with our families or friends and talk. We're usually talking about how upset we are that our sports team lost the match, or our negative things. We need to get things off our chest. So I agree totally that discussing this is really important. And to move on, this idea of the practice of behavior activation or Ikigai sounds a little bit unusual, but I guess Japanese do pursue their Ikigai, maybe on the weekends or in their relationships or in their private time. So we could say it's something you practice. So can you walk us through how behavioral activation and Ikigai are practiced in this context of treatment or therapy? Yeah, who would like to touch on that?
I think Jürgen should touch on that, as he has more experience on the therapy field. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, before I start, I have to say that what I learn, I do learn from depressed patients, not from like friends or people who are healthy and who are in my social network. I learn it from my patients. So this we have to keep in mind, but still, I do learn from them. And what I learn is how to become not just motivated. That's quite inherent in behavioral activation, because during activity monitoring and scheduling, you find out what brings you like enjoyment, but also the feeling that you did something that really was an expression of your commitment to your values. That's not the only thing, because depressed persons will obviously, if they start an action, have negative comments on it. Why am I doing this? Well, actually, it doesn't feel as good as I thought it would. Other people will not notice, things like that. So there will be these negative attentional processes, which a colleague of mine, whom I admire, Adrian Wells, called the cognitive attentive syndrome. So that explains why people tend to ruminate and keep on worrying, though it doesn't really help anybody. And Ikigai means you not only ask the right question, but you only know something from your inside, how to do it, because it gives you focus and care during your actions. This is something that we in behavioral activation teach patients. So become concentrated on what you're doing. Keep attention to what you're doing. If you decided to do it, then try to become present in that moment. Sharing time with your children, that's good. But are you really there? Or are you inside your cognitive attentive syndrome thinking about something else? Your own insufficiency and your work obligations and what other people said and what other people expecting and so on. Are you really there? And this seems to me to be inherent in Ikigai, because if you know, today I want to share time with my children. So you can ask yourself, am I sharing time? Or am I in my head somewhere else? So that's what we learn during treatment. We see people take on action and then they come back to treatment and they say, well, I did it, but it didn't feel quite good. Then, of course, the typical question of the therapist is, what did you really do? Have you been really there when sharing time with your kids? And then maybe they are saying, oh, well, yes, I was there. My body was there, but my head not. And Ikigai would give this a different shape, a different flair. So you could ask, am I really there? Am I really doing what I decided to do? And so this spin towards your action, that could be a nice import from Ikigai, so to say.
Yeah. That's a valid point. And now I'm thinking of the word engagement. I guess you do engage with your Ikigai because it's meaningful. It's based on your values, especially in a role. If you really value a role as a parent or a friend or a researcher, you'll engage in that and you'll be so present, time will disappear. But it also seems like we suffer from this insanity of ruminating on the past or worrying about the future, and we can get into these cycles where we're wasting hours of time remembering something that upset us, and it's like we're insane. So it's all very interesting, and Ikigai does offer us this alternative way to think about, how can I get through the tough times in my life? But it does sound a little odd or unnatural to say practice Ikigai, but it is something we can practice. And it reminds me of one of my guests, Trudy Boyle, amazing woman, on episode 39. And she said Ikigai is a call to action. I love that. And Ken Moggy talks about the idea of how Ikigai responds to proactiveness. You've got to get up and do something. It responds to that. You will feel Ikigai. So, this is interesting. So did you get that feeling, Nathania, like, Ikigai is not this passive thing. It's this proactive type of, I don't know what you call it, well-being, self-well-being or self-prescribed well-being. Is that the right way to say it?
I think I do get the feeling that Ikigai is this proactive way on doing things. And I think it is fascinating for me to see that you cannot just feel good if you just stand there and do nothing. I think like the closeness to this call to action is very fascinating to do so. And I think, especially if in looking at the context of this world, like you said, like this insanity of this world where you're kind of feed, like information is feed to you like nothing else, and like the last, I don't know, like the last century, like the amount of information you got feed in, I think it's also absolutely insane. So like that proactiveness to bring to like selectively decide and to intentionally choose, this is how I want to live my life, this is how I want to do my life. I think that is the core of it at the end, like that intentionality of it, that I guess intentionality in the engagement of how you do your life, and also like the information that you receive and like things like that and what to do with it. I think it is definitely that. And also referring to what Jürgen said earlier about how, sorry, I lost my point there for a little bit. I was again up in my head and I was like, wait, what was I about to say? About how asking the right question each morning, right? Like what you get up, what do you want to do? And like the intentionality behind it, I think, is definitely what really guides it. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone who knows Ikigai knows it's often expressed as the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning. But I remember listening to a podcast between two Japanese talking about it. And one of them said, actually, you know what? It's not what gets you out of bed in the morning. It's what you look forward to getting out of bed the next day. So that could infer intention or almost this anticipatory pleasure or enjoyment of thinking about, tomorrow I've got this to look forward to. And Ikigai is tied to future perspective as well. I think you would have read a little bit about Miyako Kamiya and tying Ikigai involves your perception of the future. So even if you're depressed now or struggling now, if you have goals to look forward to or things to look forward to, that can give you that focus or awareness and pull you out of that depressive state.
That's called reward anticipating and psychological depression research or in emotion
Well, there you go.
research.
Yeah.
Reward anticipating. That's something that keeps you going. If you know it's going to be great next time, you keep being motivated. It's an active process, which is disordered or disturbed once you become depressed, because during depression you think it's going on like it is today, so I'm going to be feeling sad next time too, which is not correct. You will feel next time maybe great as long as you anticipate it in your mind. So it's also about generating positive fantasies about your action.
There you go. So it's all in our mind. It's fascinating how our emotions and feelings, our state, how we communicate can be influenced. What's going on in our mind? We can be compassionate and kind if we've got something positive in our mind, and then we can be aggressive and offhand and snappy if we've got some negative thought. So it really matters to be present and aware. And I guess now we could touch on perhaps some of the similarities you uncovered between behavioral activation and Ikigai, and maybe even some of the differences might help.
I mean, it's really striking, the idea with the small steps and the idea of starting small. This is so central to behavioral therapy. It's a basic idea as behavior therapy since decades, and that comes out of this experience because the logic is quite clear. If you start small, you will start successfully. You will start with a success. If you start
Yeah.
large, you take the risk of failing, and that will not motivate you. So, having the experience that something works and you can do it, that's really motivating. And that's even increasing motivation. And then you can start doing it better next time or larger or whatever. But that's the way you bring things motivationally into life. And so that seems to be a basic principle. And in my experience as a therapist, I've always been using this. And it's paradoxically, I mean, I remember having treated a manager from a German company, and his goal was to become the CEO of that company. I guess the company is so large, it's maybe even well known abroad. I don't know.
Okay.
But then I told him the logic of starting small because he was depressed severely after having had a brain tumor surgery. And it was not realistic to still become what he wanted before. And so I told him the logic of taking on small steps. And I was afraid that he would be like disappointed. So the expectation to therapists is that they're even more wise than you are, and they have the overall sensational solution, maybe. And
Yeah.
and I'm a professor. And I told him, well, I don't have any sensational solution at all. I have the most mundane solution, which is
Start small.
start small, start with small steps, and well, we had a sensational success in that kind of therapy. He stopped his career actually, and I mean, in other words, he found his ikigai. He moved completely out of office, changed the office, began a different thing. I asked him, "What are the things that you really would like to do, given that you cannot become the CEO?" And he said, "Well, actually, I really love hunting, being out in the woods."
Oh, really?
And that's what he did, among other things.
Okay.
Well, that's, I guess, a similarity. And I guess that's something that is global wisdom. I mean, if you want to restart your life, you cannot start large.
I
You
agree.
just, if in rehabilitation treatment, I mean, you had a broken leg, Nathania.
Yeah. Yeah.
There you go.
Also had a sports injury recently, and yeah, you start small.
Yeah.
Taking the first step again is a great experience
Yeah.
because it signals you're on the right track.
Mhm.
And I mean, that's something that people are checking constantly. That's how self regulation works. We're always checking, are we on the right track? And if you take on small steps, this checking process is easier. And the feedback from the checking process will more often be, yes, you are. You can do that. You're not failing. Go on. How does that feel? It feels good. So that's one similarity. And there's another similarity, which the principle of doing things with awareness and with high quality. I mean, that's what I talked previously about. It's not just doing the action, but with awareness, with commitment, and with a certain emotional deepness. And as long as that exists, you will enjoy the action, even if it's not typically positive or pleasurable action. Just having your tax
Tax.
application done you fulfillment if you do it
Relief.
without feelings of anger and feeling under time pressure. Yeah, you can do it in a relaxed way, and so those are the similarities. I'm not clear, but if I speculate on the dissimilarities, I guess that's something that you already mentioned, Nick, that in Japanese culture, you can ask your neighbor, so how about your Ikigai today? What is it what you're committed to today? That's unusual in the West.
Yes.
So reflecting on your Ikigai seems to be embedded in the Japanese culture in a very wise and healthy way, and it does not seem so in the Western culture. Maybe our podcast can contribute to that a little.
Well, it's interesting that this idea of we've touched on doing things starting small, which obviously Ken Mogi writes about. Very powerful concept, and he does say in the West we have this all or nothing attitude, and we so it's applicable. It's like a universal concept. You can apply to everything. And then the idea of doing things well or with care, there's actually a Japanese expression called chanto suru. And, my wife's always telling me to do things properly. Or I remember when my son, I have a 20-year-old son, but when he was a young child, my wife would, when we lived in Japan, if we had visitors, she would take him by the hand to the door and say, like, chanto aisatsu shite ne. And it would like greet our guests properly. And this word chanto, we don't often say do this properly, do that properly. So Japanese do have this lexicon of words they're very powerful and they use in a daily context. But what I found really interesting was one of the case studies on a Japanese living in Germany. So Nathania, do you want to touch on this case study? I guess this young 23-year-old Japanese architect student, and ironically, Ikigai helped them. Yeah, do you want to touch on that? Yeah.
Or should I do this because it was my group treatment?
Yeah, I think it's better because that was based off on that. Yeah.
I actually really love group treatment because the principles of behavioral activation can be taught in a group as easy as in an individual treatment, and you do reach much more people. But the background of the people is quite different. So if you try to teach the principles to a group of Germans, and there's somebody from Asia among the patients, maybe the person is not, it's not so easy for the person to accommodate to the principles. And once we found out that there's a similarity, that I can say, well, basically, it's very much the same like finding your Ikigai. And you can find your Ikigai even when you're depressed. It will not help immediately, but depression does not mean that you cannot follow your Ikigai. And as long as you can follow your Ikigai despite your depression, depression will lose power over you. And that was really like woo. That I mean that at that moment the patient got it.
Like an epiphany.
You can follow up your path despite your feelings or your mood. as long as you know what your Ikigai
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, that was interesting reading that. I was like, oh, wow, this Japanese person, student away from home, struggling with their well-being. And I mean, obviously it probably took more than this, but obviously Ikigai was this trigger that made them realize, I can still
Yeah.
find meaning. I can still do things that are worthwhile that obviously impacted their well-being in a positive way after they framed it as Ikigai. Yeah. Nathania, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, no, sorry. I didn't quite realize you weren't quite done yet, but no, just like adding into it a little bit. I think the idea of like we briefly also mentioned it about like the whole like cultural bridging and like things like that. I think how if it's like something that is spoken in your mother tongue in a way, like this idea that was spoken near to you, I think that really definitely enhance that as well, like the whole treatment and things like that, especially with it's something like oh, I know that's from home.
Yeah.
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 No, just adding that. Yeah.
It would ground you, comfort you as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that was interesting. So going back to your paper, in the paper as a subheading, you asked the question, is there a cross-cultural transfer? So would you like to answer that, Nathania? Between the two concepts. Yeah.
I think the whole idea about cross-cultural transfer I find fascinating because, like, again, it's like the ideas, okay, they exist, but okay, obviously, like culture influence that as well. I think especially in the time we live now, the whole like hybrid of culture, and especially with the internet and everything, like the hybrid of the culture, even though we don't want to say that they don't exist, they exist. This hybrid of culture, like young people, the hybrid of culture between like the Eastern and the Western, it's not as distinctive anymore. So I think like finding a way to like integrate that could be one way to also like accommodate to like the next generation because you might never know what this generation received from the internet, right? You don't know like what kind of people they're talking to with it's very much possible like how we're doing this podcast right now, like this whole idea of that. So I think cross-cultural transfer in a way, I think without us even realizing it, I think it is already happening. So like the idea of like behavioral activation and ikigai and like things like that without us even realizing, or like there's like a systematic more intentional way of integrating that, like I feel like subconsciously it's already happening and we're just now realizing it. Oh, it's happening now. Oh wow, there's more people that maybe relate with more Eastern wisdom or more maybe like people with Eastern background now relates more for something more Western or more Eastern in a way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of the Japanese words that become popular, wabi-sabi is a really good one. Wabi-sabi is something you sense, you feel from an aesthetic of nature or pottery. And then in the West, it's sort of become this idea of living the imperfect life and accepting your own flaws. And the same with kintsugi. Kintsugi is this way to repair pottery. And Japanese would only understand it as that. It's this golden lacquer to pull pieces of pottery together that have been broken. But even in the West now, it's sort of embraced as, your scars sort of add to your life, and your if you're broken and you come back together, you're stronger and more beautiful. So there is this sort of transfer, even if it's a little bit lost in translation, which
yeah. As it usually happens. Yeah, sometimes that happens.
So that's interesting, yeah. And maybe that's in some ways beneficial, but Ikigai certainly got lost in translation, as you guys would know. So it's good to see people research it and
maybe not only lost, but also maybe transformed a little bit, frame it a little bit more positively.
So, yeah, this is fascinating how some words seem to stick and we fall in love with them or embrace them. I guess going back to what I was really interested in was it's obviously established that behavioral activation has continuously been demonstrated in psychotherapy to treat depression effectively across different cultures. So my question is probably to you, Jürgen, are you confident that the same can be said for Ikigai? Could it be treated as a psychotherapy to treat depression in various cultures?
Actually, that's something that Nathania and I are touching on now
Oh,
in
Yeah.
because the next step for us seems to be how can we promote prevention of depression? And Ikigai is obviously nothing that has been developed as a treatment.
no.
It's, in my view, it's a helpful and healthy strategy to look on life and my actions in life. It's just raising the right question, as I say. I would say it's not a thing that you can grasp. It's more a process of asking questions and checking out if you're on the right track in finding your ikigai of today or of the year or of your life. And so that's something that people should have the privilege to adhere to.
Mm,
And I'm very optimistic that this could work in prevention. So my vision would be, don't laugh. My vision would be to teach the Ikigai approach in German schools
fantastic.
as a form of prevention against too much negative thinking, against too much black and white thinking, against too much doubt, and a form of teaching individuality, a form of like confidently stay with yourself. And that's something that adolescents need a lot.
Mm,
That's my vision. That's what I'm optimistic about. I wouldn't say that it would add too much to behavioral activation, except in those cases which we mentioned in the article, but as a form of health prevention for
wow.
everybody, I see it to be really, really, really beneficial and very optimistic about it. And I'm really keen on learning more about it. I'm looking forward to my first trip to Japan whenever it happens. But I'm an Ikigai. I want to see Japan in my life.
Well, it's interesting you mention that because I met actually a German, I'll say his first name because he won't mind, Martin, who joined one of my cohorts just recently. I actually met him in Japan very briefly for a coffee, and he was sort of interested in one of my programs. And he said later, after his trip, he said, when we met you, Nick, we were kind of skeptical because we were in Tokyo, all these salary men, all this noise and hustle and bustle and stress. We thought, oh, is this Ikigai thing real? And then he said it was only really when we went outside of the big cities that we saw it in people. We saw it in these people um, working on their own vegetable gardens, or these people who really enjoyed having them as guests at ryokans or Airbnbs. And yeah, if you want to see Ikigai, I definitely recommend you can go to the big cities and have a bit of fun, but yeah, you'll see it truly alive in the rural areas of Japan.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
that's something I really enjoy. My wife's from a small town, and so when I get back there, it's really nice to be away from.
That would be a right nice research question too, by the way.
Mhm. Mhm.
Different sense of ikigai and rural
Yeah,
regions in
yeah.
Japan,
Yeah.
worldwide,
I mean,
than it
that's
is
interesting
elsewhere.
because Ikigai, up until now, the research in Japan's really been restricted to the elderly and what will Japanese do after retirement. And most of the studies are done based on this idea of, what do we do with our retirees or our elderly who are quite still
Mm.
healthy, but they're just not active in the community? Yeah, so there's a lot to research. I mean, is there another paper in this for you, Nathania?
In the field of Ikigai, you
Ikigai,
mean?
yeah.
Or, I mean, there's right now, I don't have anything planned, but who knows? I might be inspired after this. We might be inspired after this, and then there'll be more research on it. That's just how research works. Sometimes you talk to people, bounce off each ideas, and then suddenly you have that. That's
If there will be a grant and an invitation to Japan, Nathania, she's really excellent and really a talent for any scientific group and any university.
I don't mind.
Actually,
Be upset.
I'm having a webinar with Dr. Dean Fido and Dr. Yasuhiro Katira next week, and we're trying to generate some funding so that they can do more research. So, yeah, I think more research, especially on can it prevent depression, would be awesome. So hopefully, I mean, I'm finding more and more papers on Ikigai, everything from robot design, like how do you design social or care robots to remind the people they serve of their Ikigai, to obviously what you guys put together. So the learning, I guess the research and the learning never ends. But let's end on a personal note. What about you guys? What are some of your sources of Ikigai?
I think if I think about that question, the first thing that comes to my mind is having good coffee with good friends and like having amazing conversation. Honestly, like that is something that gets me so excited. But that's more, and I think if I do that, I'm like, I go out of these like conversation, meeting with friends and like things like that. I'm like, life's good. But other than that, I think I do, like I mentioned in the beginning, I do really enjoy doing research and writing and reading and lots of things like that, and also like how to, I guess, open up the world to like more broader or like certain concepts, especially in like psychology and like things like that, opening up to like more broader people and like how to help, ultimately how to like help people in a impactful way, I think. Yeah.
I mean, it is very much tied to our social world, but it also can be a private pursuit, but it also can be where you feel of service. So it's very multifaceted.
Yeah.
And even in Japan, they actually have, they call them health and Ikigai creation advisors. And Ikigai is framed as first person perspective. So what you do for yourself as hobbies or interests. Second person perspective with this social Ikigai, things you do with your partner, with your family, with your friends. And then third person, which is, I guess, community or service. So perhaps having, one of those or a couple of those Ikigais, or maybe hundreds, would certainly make life feel worth living. What about you, Jürgen? What are some sources of Ikigai for you?
Yeah, well, that's a form of first and second person Ikigai that I want to mention for me. I'm sure a committed teacher and researcher, and even more a committed father. And I try to be a good friend to some people. But a few years ago, I asked myself, I felt that there is something which is unfulfilled in my life. As a musician, I'm a dilettante. I can play the guitar a little bit. I don't think I can sing, but others say, well, you can. And I began writing songs.
Oh, nice.
And then I made up my mind and I thought, well, I want to have these songs recorded.
Awesome.
And that really made me, I was really frightened a little bit when I called a professional studio. And then I had to I had to grab my USB stick and play the music. And then he began headbanging a little bit and said, well, that's a song. I can record it if you want. And so that's an Ikigai. And so my first album came out when I was 64.
Congratulations. Wow.
So I'm a young musician. It's my second album will appear by the end of this month,
Wow.
and Nathania will be. She's invited to the record release party. So that's. I was always dreamed of making more music, and now I found a way to do this together with some professional musicians.
It's amazing. You've inspired me because I play guitar too. So
yeah, you could dive deeper into that. You can try find the careless responders on Spotify. That's basically the main songwriter is called Sugar Pill, and you guess who that is.
All right. Well, we might add a link. We can add a link from the show notes to your music, to your albums, as well as the paper.
That would be cool.
But yeah, if people want to reach out to you, we'll probably, I don't think you guys have any websites, but I'll put the paper in the show notes. We can put social media if you like, and we'll link to your music. Yeah, thank you very much for your time today. And thank you for writing this paper together. And it's definitely worth reading. And yeah, maybe we'll have you both back on again when you've perhaps explored Ikigai as a preventative measure to depression.
Thank you for having us and for inviting us. It was a pleasure, and it was lovely to get to chat with you.
Likewise.
It really was, Nick. Thanks a lot for having us.
My pleasure. We'll do it again. This episode was brought to you by the Find Your Ikigai course. Developed in consultation with Japan's leading Ikigai researchers, the Find Your Ikigai course is the only culturally accurate and evidence-based practical guide to the Ikigai concept. To learn more about the Find Your Ikigai course, please visit ikigaitribe.com.